This story is titled, My Father and Mother Were Telling Neighbors Dirty Things About Me, claiming I wasn't their real son. But years after they kicked me out, they demanded I give them something they desperately needed. Hey Reddit, my name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm 29 years old. This is the story of how my racist family finally received the justice they had coming to them after years of treating me and my wife like complete garbage. The sweet revenge at the end still brings a smile to my face whenever I think about it, and I hope you'll understand why by the end of this story. Let me paint you a picture of where I came from, because context is absolutely everything here. I grew up in what appeared to be the perfect upper-middle-class white family in suburban Ohio. You know the type. My father David had inherited a chain of 3 successful sporting goods stores from his own father back in the early 1990s. These weren't your typical competitors to Dick's Sporting Goods either. Dad's stores specialized in high-end hunting and fishing equipment, with contracts to several local outfitters and hunting clubs throughout the region. Business was genuinely good. Really, really good. My mother Patricia was the stereotypical trophy wife who had married into money and never worked a day in her life. She spent her time organizing charity events for the country club, making absolutely sure that everyone in town knew we drove luxury cars, and planning elaborate vacations specifically to show off on social media. She was exactly the type of person who would post pictures of our family at expensive steakhouses with captions like, "Blessed to have such a wonderful life, grateful family first." Everything in our household revolved around image and status. Our house was this massive colonial situated in the absolute best neighborhood in town, with landscaping that was always perfectly maintained. Mom would throw these elaborate dinner parties where she'd invite other wealthy families from the area. Everything had to be absolutely perfect. The right china, the right wine selections, and most importantly, the right conversations about all the right topics. The whole production was designed to reinforce our family's position in the local social hierarchy. But here's the thing about my parents that most people didn't see. They were racist as hell, just incredibly subtle about it in public. They'd smile and be perfectly polite to minorities when they were out in the community, but behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. They'd lock their car doors when driving through certain neighborhoods, make snide comments about those people bringing down property values, and my dad would go on lengthy rants about how immigrants were supposedly taking jobs away from real Americans. I remember being maybe 12 years old and overhearing my mom on the phone with her sister talking about how the new family down the street was nice enough, but you know how they are with maintaining their yards. The family she was referring to was black, and honestly, their yard looked absolutely identical to everyone else's on our street. That's when I first started to understand that my parents viewed the world through a very specific and ugly lens. My little brother Tyler was 3 years younger than me and had absolutely bought into everything our parents believed without question. He was unquestionably the golden child in our family, the star quarterback in high school who dated the homecoming queen, blonde, rich, and white, of course, got into the right fraternity at Ohio State University, and was being actively groomed to eventually take over the family business and continue the legacy, as Dad always called it. Me? I was consistently the disappointment in the family. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't a complete screw-up by any means. I managed decent grades throughout school and stayed out of trouble, but I just never fit their carefully constructed mold. I wasn't interested in sports, didn't care about impressing the country club crowd, and I sure as hell didn't share their views on race and social status. After high school, I decided to attend the University of Cincinnati for mechanical engineering instead of Ohio State for business like they desperately wanted me to do. They remained pissed about that choice for literally years afterward. State school, my mom would say with obvious disgust whenever people asked where I went to college, like I'd chosen to become a drug dealer or something equally scandalous. After graduation, I landed a job at a mid-sized manufacturing company as a design engineer. The pay was decent, and I worked my way up steadily over the years. It wasn't amazing money, but it was definitely enough for me to live comfortably in my own apartment without depending on mommy and daddy for financial support. However, my parents acted like I was flipping burgers for a living. "When are you going to get a real career?" my mom would ask pointedly at family dinners. The Henderson's son just made partner at his law firm. He's only 27 and already making serious money. The thing is, I was genuinely happy with my life. I liked my job, had developed good friendships, and was living my own life without constantly worrying about what the country club wives thought about my choices. But that level of contentment wasn't nearly enough for them. Nothing was ever sufficient unless it came with prestige and serious bragging rights. So there I was at 26 years old, living in my own place and genuinely minding my own business, when I met the woman who would completely change everything about my life. Her name was Sophia, but everyone who knew her called her Sophie. I first encountered her at a professional development conference for young engineers that was being held in Cleveland. She was presenting on sustainable manufacturing processes, and I swear this woman was the absolute smartest person I'd ever met in my entire life. Sophie had her master's degree in environmental engineering and worked for a major consulting firm where she was making genuinely good money. She could talk circles around anyone in that conference room when it came to technical subjects, and her presentation was both brilliant and engaging. She was also absolutely gorgeous. She had long, dark hair, these incredible brown eyes that seemed to sparkle when she talked about her work, and a smile that literally made my brain stop working properly whenever she directed it at me. Oh, and she happened to be Mexican-American. Her grandparents had immigrated to Florida back in the 1940s, but her family had been established in the United States for 3 full generations by the time I met her. Her father, Carlos, worked as a project manager for a well-respected construction company, and her mother, Rosa, was a registered nurse at a children's hospital in their area. They were hard-working, middle-class people who had built a solid, respectable life for their family through dedication and perseverance. We started talking after her presentation had concluded, and I was immediately hooked on everything about her. She was funny, incredibly ambitious, passionate about her work, and she seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say about my own career and experiences. We exchanged phone numbers before the conference ended, and I worked up the courage to ask her out for coffee the following weekend. That initial coffee date naturally turned into dinner, which evolved into going to see a movie together, which somehow transformed into us sitting in her car outside my apartment, talking until 3 o'clock in the morning about everything and nothing. I honestly hadn't felt this way about anyone before in my entire life, and the intensity of it was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. We started dating seriously after about a month of getting to know each other better. Sophie was everything I never knew I wanted in a partner, and more. She was smart as hell but also completely down to earth about her accomplishments. She was ambitious and driven in her career, but also deeply family-oriented in her values. She could discuss complex engineering problems with impressive expertise one minute, then laugh hysterically at stupid YouTube videos the next. The best part about our relationship was that she genuinely liked me for who I actually was as a person. She didn't care that I drove a used Honda Civic instead of some flashy BMW. She didn't care that I lived in a regular apartment instead of some fancy downtown condo. Most importantly, she didn't try to change me or mold me into someone else's idea of what success should look like. She appreciated my work ethic, enjoyed my sense of humor, and seemed to value the same things in life that I did. After about 6 months of dating, I knew without any doubt that I was completely in love with her. Like head over heels. Want to spend the rest of my life with this woman kind of love. The problem was that I knew my family was going to absolutely lose their minds when they eventually met her, and that knowledge was eating away at me constantly. I'd been dropping subtle hints about this amazing woman I was dating whenever I talked to my parents, but I kept finding excuses to put off introducing them to each other. My mom would ask with increasing frequency when she was going to get to meet my girlfriend, and I'd make up reasons why it wasn't convenient. Work was particularly busy. Scheduling was difficult. Maybe we could plan something for next month. Sophie started asking pointed questions about this delay as well. When do I get to meet your family? She'd ask with genuine curiosity. You've met my parents 3 different times already, but I haven't even seen a single picture of yours. I kept making increasingly weak excuses because I knew exactly what was coming, and it made me physically sick to my stomach just thinking about it. I'd grown up listening to my parents' casual racism my entire life, and I knew precisely what they would think about Sophie the moment they met her. Before I finally worked up the courage to bring Sophie home, I decided to test the waters with my family by dropping some carefully chosen details about her background. This turned out to be a massive mistake. One Thursday evening at our regular family dinner, I mentioned casually that Sophie spoke fluent Spanish in addition to English, thinking this might be an innocuous way to gauge their reaction. My mom immediately perked up with that fake, overly interested tone she always used when she was fishing for gossip. "Oh, is she foreign?" she asked with poorly concealed curiosity. "No, she was born in Miami," I replied carefully. "But her family is Mexican-American." The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop about 20 degrees instantly. My dad looked up from his plate with an expression I'd seen countless times before. The same one he got when he watched the news and saw stories about immigration policy. "Well," my mom said with deliberate carefulness, "I'm sure she's a very nice girl." Tyler, who was 23 at the time and still living at home, decided to chime in with some helpful commentary about how I should be careful because you know how those families can be with money. He said this like Sophie was some kind of gold digger who was trying to trap me for my modest engineering salary, which was absolutely ridiculous given that she was making more money than I was. My dad didn't say much during that particular dinner, but I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he processed this information. After dinner concluded, he pulled me aside for what he probably thought was going to be a helpful father-son conversation. "Son," he said, with the tone of someone delivering sage wisdom, "you know I'm not prejudiced against anyone." This was always how these conversations started, the classic disclaimer before saying something incredibly prejudiced. But you have to think seriously about your future here. What's going to happen when you want to have children? They're going to be confused about their identity, caught between two different worlds. And frankly, what are people going to think about this situation? "What people?" I asked, even though I knew exactly which people he was referring to. "You know what I mean," he continued. "Our family has a reputation to maintain in this community. We have important business relationships, social connections that matter. This kind of thing reflects on all of us, whether you want to acknowledge it or not." I told him he was being completely ridiculous and that Sophie was the best thing that had ever happened to me. He just shook his head like I was some naive kid who didn't understand how the real world actually operated. "Just think about it," he said as I was leaving. "That's all I'm asking you to do. Think about whether this relationship is really worth potentially damaging your future prospects and our family's standing in the community." I left that conversation with my father knowing that introducing Sophie to my family was going to be an absolute disaster. But I also realized I couldn't keep making excuses forever. She was starting to think that I was ashamed of her, which couldn't have been further from the truth. The reality was that I was ashamed of them, not her. After 8 months of dating, I finally worked up the courage to bring Sophie home for our traditional Thursday family dinner. I tried my best to prepare her for what we were walking into. But honestly, how do you tell the woman you love that your family are racist pieces of shit without sounding like you're making excuses for their behavior? I settled for telling her that my parents were quite traditional and might ask some awkward questions, which was the understatement of the century. What I should have said was, "My parents are going to treat you like garbage because you're not white, and I'm sorry in advance for everything they're about to say and do." The moment we walked through the front door, I could see the shock register on my mom's face. She'd been expecting, well, I don't know exactly what she'd been expecting, but it definitely wasn't Sophie. Her practiced smile faltered for just a split second before she managed to put on her fake country club hostess act that she'd perfected over the years. "You must be Sophia," she said, pronouncing every single syllable very carefully, like she was speaking to a small child who might not understand English properly. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you after hearing so much about you." My dad shook Sophie's hand politely enough, but I could see him sizing her up the entire time, probably wondering internally if she was in the country legally, despite the fact that I'd already explicitly told them she was born in Miami. We sat down for dinner, and that's when the interrogation began in earnest. My mom started with what she probably thought were friendly, getting-to-know-you questions, but they were actually passive-aggressive inquiries disguised as polite conversation. "Your English is so good," she said with false admiration. "You hardly have any accent at all. How long has your family been living in America? What do your parents do for work?" she continued, clearly trying to assess Sophie's family's social and economic status. "And what part of the country are you originally from?" Sophie handled these inappropriate questions like an absolute champion at first. She patiently explained that she was born in Florida, that her father worked in construction management, and that her mother was a registered nurse. She remained polite and patient even as the questions became increasingly more invasive and uncomfortable. Then my mom asked the question that made my blood start to boil. "And what's your background, dear? You look so exotic." The way she said the word exotic made me want to crawl under the table and disappear. She said it like Sophie was some kind of rare bird at the zoo instead of a successful engineer with a master's degree who was probably smarter than everyone else at that dinner table combined. Sophie politely explained her Mexican heritage and talked about how proud she was of her family's history and cultural traditions. My parents just sat there with these frozen, artificial smiles plastered on their faces, exchanging meaningful looks when they thought we weren't paying attention. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. My dad started asking pointed questions about her family's legal status. And yes, he actually used those exact words in front of my girlfriend. My mom wanted to know if Sophie planned to keep her culture after we got married. Saying this with a tone that made it sound like maintaining cultural traditions was something shameful that needed to be hidden. Tyler barely said a single word during the entire dinner. He just sat there looking uncomfortable while his parents systematically embarrassed our entire family with their ignorant questions and thinly veiled racism. By the time we left their house, Sophie had gone completely quiet, and I knew we were in for a very difficult conversation. The drive back to Sophie's apartment was painfully silent. I kept glancing over at her, trying to read her expression, but she was just staring out the passenger window with a look I'd never seen before. Finally, about halfway home, she spoke up. "Your parents hate me." I started to deny it automatically, but she cut me off before I could get the words out. "Don't," she said firmly. "Just don't. I've dealt with this kind of treatment my whole life, and I know exactly what it looks like. Your mom spent the entire dinner trying to figure out what was wrong with me, and your dad was about 2 seconds away from asking to see my green card. She was absolutely right, and we both knew it." I apologized profusely and tried to tell her that they'd come around eventually, that they just needed some time to get to know her better. But even as I said these words, I wasn't sure I believed them myself. "The thing that bothers me the most," Sophie said quietly, "isn't even how they treated me tonight. It's that you let them do it. You sat there and let your mother call me exotic, like I was some kind of zoo animal, and you didn't say a single word to defend me." That observation hit me like a punch to the gut, because she was absolutely, completely right. I'd been so focused on trying to keep the peace and avoid making the situation worse that I'd essentially thrown the woman I loved under the bus. I promised her it would never happen again, and I meant it. The next day, my mom called with that particular tone in her voice that meant I was in serious trouble. "We need to talk," she said curtly. "Can you come over this evening?" I drove over to their house that evening to find both parents waiting for me in the living room, like some kind of intervention setup. My dad was pacing back and forth. My mom was sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We need to discuss this situation with Sophia," my dad started without any preamble. "Her name is Sophie," I corrected him. "And what situation exactly are we discussing?" My mom jumped in immediately with the classic, "We're not racist," but speech that racist people always give when they're about to say something incredibly racist. "She seems like a nice enough girl," my mom said, with fake reasonableness. "But you have to think seriously about your future here. What about children? They'll be confused about their identity, caught between two different worlds. And honestly, what will people think about this whole situation?" "What people?" I asked, even though I already knew exactly what she meant. "You know what people," my dad said with obvious frustration. "Our friends, the business community, everyone we know in this town. We've worked incredibly hard to build a solid reputation in this community, and frankly, this kind of relationship reflects poorly on our entire family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing from these people who had raised me. "This kind of relationship?" I asked. "You mean a relationship with someone I love?" My dad waved his hand dismissively like my feelings were completely irrelevant. "Love fades," he said coldly. "What actually matters in the long run is compatibility, shared values, and similar backgrounds. You're setting yourself up for serious problems down the road with this choice." Then my mom really went completely off the deep end with her reasoning. "Think about the children you might have," she said, getting more animated as she spoke. "They won't fit in anywhere. They'll be too Mexican for the white kids and too white for the Mexican kids. They'll be confused and angry about their identity, and they'll blame you for putting them in that position. And what about holidays?" she continued, building up steam. "Are we supposed to pretend to enjoy their food and music? Are you going to start speaking Spanish at family gatherings? Are we expected to learn about all their traditions and customs?" The racism was just pouring out of them now that they'd dropped all pretense of being polite about the situation. "Here's the bottom line," my dad said, looking me directly in the eyes. "You can date whoever you want, but don't expect us to pretend we're happy about this choice. And if you're serious about this girl, you need to think carefully about whether she's really worth losing your family over." I stared at both of them, trying to process what I was hearing. These were the people who had raised me, who had told me my entire life that family was the most important thing in the world. And now they were giving me an ultimatum. Choose between the woman I loved and them. "You're really going to make me choose?" I asked in disbelief. "We're not making you do anything," my mom said, with fake tears starting to form in her eyes. "We're just asking you to think about what's best for everyone involved in this situation." I stood up to leave because I'd heard enough. "I don't need to think about anything," I said firmly. "Sophie is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and if you can't accept that fact, then that's your problem, not mine." My mom started crying for real then, with actual tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to us?" she sobbed. "What did we do to deserve this kind of treatment from you?" I looked at both of them. These people who had shaped my entire childhood and upbringing. and I realized I was seeing them clearly for the first time in my life. "You want to know what you did to deserve this?" I said. "You raised me to believe that family was supposed to be about love and acceptance. And then you showed me that you only meant love and acceptance for people who look exactly like us." I walked out that day knowing that our relationship would never, ever be the same. After that disaster of a confrontation, my relationship with my parents went from strained to practically non-existent. They would call maybe once every few months, usually when they needed something from me or when guilt got the better of them around major holidays. The conversations were always stilted and uncomfortable, filled with passive-aggressive comments and unspoken resentment. Despite their disapproval, Sophie and I got engaged exactly 1 year later. I proposed at the same professional development conference where we'd first met during the dinner reception on the final evening. She said yes immediately, and we started planning our wedding with genuine excitement and joy. My parents didn't come to our engagement party. They claimed they had prior commitments even though I'd given them over 2 months advance notice. Tyler did show up, but he spent most of the evening looking visibly uncomfortable and avoiding any meaningful conversation with Sophie's family members. It was clear that he was torn between loyalty to our parents and some small part of him that recognized how wrong their behavior was. We got married 8 months later in a beautiful ceremony at a historic mansion just outside Cleveland. It was absolutely everything we had dreamed of and more. We had about 150 guests, the food was amazing, and we danced until well past midnight. Sophie looked absolutely stunning in her dress, and I felt like the luckiest man alive as I watched her walk down the aisle toward me. My parents didn't come to our wedding either. They used the same excuse about prior commitments. But this time, the supposedly unmovable commitment was a weekend trip to Mackinac Island that they had conveniently booked for the exact same weekend as our wedding. The message they were sending was crystal clear. They would rather take a vacation than attend their own son's wedding because they disapproved of his choice of bride. Tyler did attend the wedding, and he even walked Sophie's younger sister down the aisle since her father was walking Sophie. It was a small gesture, but it meant something significant to both of us. Maybe there was still hope for him to break free from our parents' poisonous influence after all. The funny thing is that while my parents were busy disapproving of my life choices and maintaining their racist stance, things were going incredibly well for Sophie and me. I'd gotten promoted twice at work and was now making genuinely solid money as a senior design engineer. Sophie had also received a significant promotion at her consulting firm and was doing exceptionally well in her career. We bought a beautiful house in a great neighborhood, took vacations to places we'd always wanted to visit, and built a life together that we were genuinely proud of. We were happy, really, truly happy, in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with impressing other people or maintaining some artificial image. Our happiness came from our love for each other, our shared goals and values, and the life we were building together based on mutual respect and support. Meanwhile, my parents' supposedly perfect world was starting to develop some serious cracks. The sporting goods business was struggling significantly as more and more customers shifted to shopping online. Big box stores like Dick's Sporting Goods were undercutting their prices on popular items, and my dad was too stubborn and set in his traditional ways to adapt to the rapidly changing retail market. I heard through mutual friends and acquaintances that they'd been forced to lay off several long-term employees and were experiencing serious cash flow problems. My mom had to give up her weekly spa appointments and significantly cut back on the elaborate dinner parties she'd always loved to throw for her country club friends. But did they reach out for help or try to repair our damaged relationship? Of course not. They were far too proud and too convinced that they were right about everything. Tyler had graduated from Ohio State and joined the family business as planned, but he didn't have the vision, experience, or innovative thinking necessary to turn things around. He was perfectly capable of following orders and maintaining existing operations, but strategic thinking and business innovation simply weren't his strong suits. The writing was clearly on the wall regarding the future of the business, but they all refused to acknowledge what was happening. About 3 years after our wedding, Tyler married his college girlfriend Vanessa. She was exactly what you'd expect from my family's idea of the perfect choice. Blonde, came from old money, had never worked a day in her life, but somehow had very strong opinions about people who did work for a living. They had a huge, elaborate wedding that probably cost significantly more than my parents could realistically afford at that point, but they had to keep up appearances at all costs. Vanessa's family was even wealthier than ours had ever been, or at least wealthier than we used to be before the business started failing. My parents were desperately trying to maintain their social standing in the community, and this marriage represented their last chance to stay connected to the upper echelon of local society. After their wedding, Tyler and Vanessa moved into a massive house that Vanessa's father had purchased for them as a wedding gift. Tyler continued working at the family business, making decent money, and Vanessa spent her time playing housewife and planning charity events with my mother. They were the golden couple in my parents' eyes. Everything that Sophie and I should have been. If only I hadn't been so selfish with my choice of wife. For the first 2 years of their marriage, everything seemed absolutely perfect for them from the outside. They took expensive vacations to exotic destinations, drove matching luxury cars, and Vanessa posted constantly on social media about their blessed life and how grateful she was for everything they had. But there was one significant thing missing from their picture-perfect existence: babies. My parents were completely obsessed with the idea of having grandchildren. My mom would make comments constantly about how she couldn't wait to become a grandmother, how she'd already picked out potential names, and how she was going to spoil her future grandkids absolutely rotten. Vanessa was equally obsessed with the prospect of motherhood. She'd been talking about having children since she was a teenager, had already picked out names for their future children, and had even gone ahead and decorated a nursery in their new house. But months turned into a full year, and then that year turned into 2 years, and still there was no pregnancy announcement forthcoming. I could tell it was starting to create serious stress for everyone involved, though they all tried their best to hide their growing anxiety and frustration. Vanessa would make increasingly forced jokes about her broken biological clock, but you could see the genuine desperation starting to show in her eyes. Tyler began getting visibly defensive whenever the topic of children came up in any conversation. My mom started making passive-aggressive comments about how some people just aren't meant to be parents, and how everything happens for a reason. Really supportive stuff, as you can imagine. Finally, after 3 full years of trying unsuccessfully to conceive, they made the decision to see a fertility specialist. The testing process took several months, and I could tell that everyone in the family was getting increasingly anxious while waiting for the results. The anticipation was eating away at all of them. Then the test results finally came back, and the news was devastating. Tyler's sperm count was severely low, like almost completely non-existent according to the medical reports. The doctor explained in clear terms that natural conception was essentially impossible given his numbers, and that even in vitro fertilization would be a very long shot with his current fertility levels. I actually felt genuinely sorry for them when I heard this news. Whatever else you could say about Tyler and Vanessa's character or their values, I knew they wanted children desperately, and you could see how completely devastated they both were by this diagnosis. They decided to try IVF anyway, hoping against hope for some kind of miracle. Vanessa's wealthy father paid for the expensive treatments, 2 full rounds that cost approximately $20,000 each. Both attempts failed completely. The doctor finally sat them down and explained with professional compassion that their best realistic chance of having a baby would be to use a sperm donor. Tyler was apparently absolutely devastated by this news. His entire identity and sense of self-worth was wrapped up in being the perfect son who would continue the family legacy and produce the next generation. And now he couldn't even father children naturally. That's when things got really interesting from my perspective. I hadn't spoken to anyone in my family for several months when I received an unexpected phone call from Tyler. He sounded genuinely nervous, which was highly unusual for him. Tyler had always been confident, even somewhat cocky, about everything in his life up to this point. "Hey," he said, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I know things have been really weird between you and Mom and Dad for a while now, but I need to talk to you about something important. I was curious despite myself and all the bad blood between us. What's going on? Can we set up a video call?" he asked. "Me and Vanessa want to discuss something with you. It's kind of a big deal, and we'd prefer to do this face-to-face, even if it's virtual." Red flags were immediately going off in my head, but I found myself agreeing anyway. We scheduled the call for the following Tuesday evening. When I joined the video conference, I was surprised to see not just Tyler and Vanessa sitting there, but my parents as well. And there was another woman I didn't recognize, a professional-looking person, probably in her 40s, wearing business attire. "Thanks for joining us," Tyler said, still sounding uncharacteristically nervous. "This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She's a fertility counselor who's been helping us navigate through this whole process." The woman smiled warmly and waved at me through the screen. "It's really nice to meet you, Marcus. Tyler and Vanessa have told me so much about you and your accomplishments." I was immediately suspicious about why they would need a professional counselor for what was supposed to be a family conversation. "Okay," I said slowly. "So what exactly is this about?" Tyler and Vanessa exchanged a meaningful look, and then Tyler began explaining their situation. He told me about the fertility issues they'd been experiencing, the failed IVF attempts, and the devastating diagnosis about his extremely low sperm count. I listened politely, genuinely feeling bad for them despite everything that had happened between our families. Then Dr. Walsh started talking about family matching and genetic compatibility and fertility treatments. She had professional charts and graphs showing success rates for different types of sperm donors. One option that many families consider, she explained in her practiced clinical tone, is using a known donor from within the family unit. It keeps the genetic lineage intact and ensures that everyone involved knows the complete medical history of the donor. I was starting to see exactly where this conversation was heading, but I couldn't quite believe they were actually going there. My mom jumped into the conversation at that point. "We've been thinking about this situation a lot," she said with forced enthusiasm, "and we think it could be a really wonderful solution for everyone involved in this difficult situation." "What solution exactly?" I asked, even though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Vanessa started crying at this point, which seemed to be her default response to emotional stress. "We want you to be our sperm donor," she said through her tears. "We want you to help us have a baby." The silence that followed her request was absolutely deafening. I just sat there staring at my computer screen, trying to process what I had just heard. These people who had essentially disowned me for marrying a Mexican woman were now asking me to father their grandchild. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dr. Walsh started talking about what she called the beautiful symmetry of keeping everything within the family. And my dad was nodding along enthusiastically, going on about how this would ensure that the family genes stayed pure and strong. But the thing that really got to me was when my mom started talking about what a blessing this would supposedly be for me personally. "You'd finally have a chance to contribute something truly meaningful to the family legacy," she said with fake sincerity. "Instead of wasting your life with that woman, you could help create the next generation of our family." That's when I completely lost my composure. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice rising with anger. "You people essentially disowned me for marrying the woman I love. You refused to come to my wedding. You've treated my wife like absolute garbage for years. And now you want me to donate sperm so you can have the grandchild you've always wanted?" Vanessa was sobbing even harder now, which seemed to be her go-to manipulation tactic. "We're desperate," she managed to say between dramatic sobs. "We've tried absolutely everything else, and this is our last hope." "And what about Sophie?" I asked pointedly. "Is she invited to this family reunion, or are we still pretending that she doesn't exist?" My parents exchanged another one of their meaningful looks before my mom answered carefully. "Well," she said with obvious reluctance, "she could certainly be involved as the baby's aunt." "Aunt?" I said incredulously. "Not aunt-in-law, but actual aunt? So now you're suddenly acknowledging that she's actually part of this family?" The hypocrisy was absolutely breathtaking. Dr. Walsh tried to jump in with some professional mediation techniques, but I was completely done listening to any of them. "I need some time to think about this," I said firmly. "This is obviously a lot to process, and I can't give you an answer right now." They all started talking at once, trying to convince me with various emotional appeals and logical arguments, but I cut them off. "I said I need to think about it," I repeated more forcefully. "I'll get back to you with my decision." I ended the call and sat there in stunned silence for several minutes. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the sheer audacity of their request. The same people who had spent years telling me that I was a disappointment to the family, who had boycotted my wedding, and who had treated my wife like she was beneath them, now wanted my DNA to save their precious family legacy. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this might actually be an incredible opportunity. An opportunity for some long overdue justice. I discussed the situation extensively with Sophie, and she was just as disgusted by their request as I was. "They want to use you like a prize bull," she said bluntly. "They want to create their perfect white grandchild and then go back to pretending that we don't exist." "What if we don't let them do that?" I said, an idea starting to form in my mind. "What do you mean exactly?" "What if we make them pay for everything they've done to us over the years?" We talked about it for hours that night, developing a plan that would give them exactly what they deserved after years of racist treatment. The next day, I called Tyler back. "I've been thinking about your request," I said carefully. "I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no either. I do have some questions that need to be answered first." He sounded incredibly relieved just to hear that I was still considering it. "Of course," he said eagerly. "Ask me anything you want to know." "First question," I said. "What exactly would my role be in this arrangement? Would I have any kind of relationship with the child?" "Well, you'd be the uncle," he said without hesitation. "You could definitely be involved in that capacity if you wanted to be." "And what about the legal aspects?" Would I have any parental rights whatsoever? No, absolutely not, he replied quickly. You'd sign away all legal rights before the procedure. The baby would be legally ours in every way. And what about compensation for this? I asked. There was a brief pause before he answered. Vanessa's dad has offered to pay all the medical expenses plus a $15,000 fee for your time and, contribution to the process. $15,000. They actually thought they could buy me for 15 grand after everything they had put Sophie and me through. I need to discuss all of this with Sophie, I said. Can you give me about a week to think everything over and make my final decision? Of course, he said quickly. Take all the time you need. We're just grateful that you're even considering helping us. Over the next week, they called me constantly. Text messages, voicemails, emails. The desperation was absolutely palpable. My mom even tried calling Sophie directly, which was literally the first time she'd spoken to my wife in years. I know we've had our differences in the past, she told Sophie with fake humility, but this could be a fresh start for all of us. A real chance to bring the family back together. Sophie was polite but completely non-committal. We're still discussing the situation, she said diplomatically. Finally, I called Tyler and asked for one more family meeting. Same setup as before. Video call with everyone present, including Dr. Walsh, I said. I've made my decision. I've made my decision, I announced once everyone was assembled on the video call. You could see them all lean forward eagerly, hanging on my every word with desperate anticipation. I'm willing to help you, I said, and relief immediately flooded all of their faces. Vanessa was crying happy tears now instead of desperate ones. But I do have some non-negotiable conditions, I continued, and their expressions started to change slightly. First, I said firmly, I want a public apology. You're going to post on Facebook apologizing to me and Sophie for your behavior over the past several years. Their expressions started to shift, but I wasn't finished yet. Second, Sophie and I are going to be included in all family events from now on. No more excluding us from holidays, birthdays, or any other gatherings. We're family, and you're going to treat us like family. My dad started to look visibly uncomfortable, but he nodded his agreement. Third, the compensation is now $35,000, not $15,000. And I want half of it paid up front before any procedures begin. Vanessa's dad winced noticeably at that amount, but he nodded as well. And fourth, I said, I want it in writing that I'll have regular contact with the child. Not just as an uncle, but as someone who played a crucial role in their creation. Dr. Walsh looked genuinely concerned about that last point, but everyone else was so desperate they were ready to agree to absolutely anything. Is that everything? Tyler asked hopefully. Actually, no, I said. There's one more thing. They all waited in tense silence. I want you to admit that you were completely wrong about Sophie, about our marriage, and about everything else. I want you to acknowledge that your behavior has been racist and hurtful, and that you're genuinely sorry for all of it. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, my mom spoke up in a quiet voice. If that's what it takes, she said reluctantly. Okay, I said. Let me talk to Sophie about all the details, and I'll get back to you with my final answer. After I ended the call, Sophie and I looked at each other and started laughing. They had absolutely no idea what was coming their way. I let them stew in their anticipation for another full week, checking in occasionally to make sure they were still interested and committed to moving forward. They were, in fact, getting more desperate and excited by the day. Tyler was calling me every other day with updates about how grateful they were and how this was going to completely change everything for our family's future. Vanessa sent me a long, emotional email detailing how she'd already started redecorating the nursery and how she couldn't wait for me to meet our baby. My mom posted a cryptic Facebook status about exciting family news and how sometimes God works in mysterious ways. She was already planning the baby shower in her head and probably imagining all the social media posts she'd make about her perfect grandchild. Finally, I called for one last family meeting. I've made my final decision, I announced once everyone was assembled on the video call again. Their faces were absolutely glowing with anticipation and hope. Vanessa was practically bouncing in her chair with excitement. After a lot of thought and extensive discussion with Sophie, I said slowly, building the suspense, I've decided that I'm willing to help you. Cheers and celebration erupted from their end of the call. Vanessa was crying tears of joy, Tyler was grinning from ear to ear like he'd just won the lottery, and my parents were actually hugging each other with genuine happiness for the first time in years. But then I continued speaking, and the celebration came to an abrupt halt. However, I need to make absolutely sure that you understand exactly what you're agreeing to here, I said with deliberate seriousness. Of course, Tyler said eagerly. Whatever you need us to understand, we're ready. You're agreeing to publicly apologize for years of racist behavior toward my wife, I stated clearly. Nods all around the screen. You're agreeing to include us in all family activities going forward, I continued. More enthusiastic nods. You're agreeing to pay me $35,000 for my genetic material, I said. Vanessa's dad already has the money set aside and ready, Vanessa chimed in quickly. And you're agreeing to let me have a meaningful relationship with this child, I concluded. Absolutely, my mom said with forced enthusiasm. You'll be the favorite uncle and we'll make sure the child knows how important you are. I smiled broadly at all of them. Great, I'm so glad we're all on the same page about this arrangement. They all smiled back expectantly, thinking they had finally won and gotten exactly what they wanted. There's just one tiny little problem, I said, and their smiles immediately faltered. What? Vanessa whispered, clearly sensing that something was wrong. I'm not actually going to do it, I said calmly. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. What? Vanessa repeated, this time in a much smaller voice. I'm not going to donate sperm, I said clearly. I'm not going to help you have a baby. I'm not going to contribute to your precious family legacy. The color completely drained from all of their faces as the reality of what I was saying hit them. But you said… Tyler started to protest weakly. I said I was willing to help you and I am, I interrupted him. I'm helping you learn a very important lesson about consequences. My mom found her voice first, though it was shaky. You can't be serious about this. Oh, I'm completely dead serious, I replied. You see, I've spent the last few weeks thinking very carefully about what kind of people would disown their own son for marrying someone they consider beneath them, and then turn around and beg that same son for help when they desperately need something. Vanessa was sobbing now, but these definitely weren't happy tears anymore. You had 6 years, I continued relentlessly. 6 full years to apologize for your disgusting behavior. 6 years to try to build any kind of relationship with the woman I love. 6 years to show me that family actually meant something to you beyond just getting what you wanted. My dad's face was turning red with anger, but he couldn't say anything because they still thought they might need me. But you didn't want a relationship with me or my wife, I pressed on. You wanted to pretend we didn't exist until it became convenient for you to acknowledge us because you needed something from us. That's not fair, my mom said weakly, her voice cracking. What's not fair is treating people like absolute garbage for years and then expecting them to help you when it's convenient. I shot back. What's not fair is being racist for years and then suddenly wanting to be family when you need my DNA to continue your bloodline. I could see the panic starting to set in as they realized this was their last hope, and I was systematically taking it away from them. Here's what's actually going to happen, I said, watching their faces crumble in real time. You're going to have to figure this whole situation out on your own. You're going to have to accept that your actions have real consequences. And most importantly, you're going to have to learn that treating people like shit for years doesn't just get magically erased because you suddenly need something from them. Vanessa was full-on sobbing now, barely able to speak. Please, she begged desperately. We're absolutely desperate. We've tried everything else possible. Have you tried not being racist pieces of shit? I asked bluntly. Because that approach might have opened up some other options for you over the years. Tyler tried to jump in with a desperate appeal. Come on, man, we're family. Family? I laughed bitterly. You mean like how we were family when you boycotted my wedding? Like how we were family when mom called my wife exotic, like she was some kind of zoo animal? Like how we were family when dad questioned her immigration status, even though she was born in Miami? Dr. Walsh attempted to mediate the situation. Perhaps we can find some kind of compromise here. There is no compromise, I said firmly. You people spent years making it crystal clear that I wasn't really part of this family unless I played by your rules and married the right kind of person. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. I'm not part of your family, which means I don't owe you shit. My mom was crying now too, tears streaming down her face. We can change, she said desperately. We can do better going forward. Too little, too late, I replied without sympathy. You had your chance to do better. Multiple chances, actually. You chose to be awful instead. What do you want from us? My dad asked, his voice cracking with desperation. I don't want anything from you, I said. That's exactly the point. I've built an incredible life without you. I have a wife who loves me unconditionally, a job I genuinely enjoy, and friends who actually respect me as a person. I don't need your approval, your money, or your fake acceptance. Vanessa was hyperventilating at this point. You're destroying our lives, she managed to say between gasping sobs. No, I corrected her. You destroyed your own lives when you decided that hating people based on their skin color was more important than treating your family with basic human decency. But we apologized, my mom said weakly, grasping at straws. You apologized because you wanted something from me, I pointed out. That's not a real apology, that's manipulation. I looked at each of their faces on the screen. They were devastated, desperate, and completely broken. And I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sympathy, no regret whatsoever. You know what the really funny part is? I said. If you had just been decent human beings from the beginning, I might have actually considered helping you. If you had welcomed Sophie into the family with open arms, if you had treated her with the respect she deserved, if you had shown up to our wedding and made a genuine effort to build a real relationship with us, we might be having a very different conversation right now. We can still do that, Tyler said desperately. We can start over completely. Start over? I laughed. You think you can just erase 6 years of racist bullshit with a few crocodile tears? You think I'm going to risk my genetic material creating a child that you'll raise with the same backwards, hateful values that you tried to raise me with? The truth was finally hitting them. They weren't just losing their last chance at having a biological grandchild. They were losing it directly because of their own actions and choices. The call ended with all of them crying and begging. But I was completely done with the conversation. I hung up and turned to Sophie, who had been listening from the next room the entire time. She had the biggest smile on her face that I'd seen in years. How do you feel? She asked. Like I just took out years of accumulated trash, I said with satisfaction. That was 2 years ago, and I haven't spoken to any of them since that final video call. I heard through mutual friends and acquaintances that Tyler and Vanessa eventually went with an anonymous sperm donor from a fertility clinic. But the stress of everything that had happened completely broke their marriage apart. They divorced about 6 months after our final confrontation, unable to recover from the emotional devastation and the collapse of their dreams. Vanessa moved back in with her wealthy parents, essentially admitting defeat and returning to the safety net of her family's money. Tyler, meanwhile, moved back in with our parents, a 29-year-old man living in his childhood bedroom like some kind of failure to launch. The golden boy who was supposed to continue the family legacy had been reduced to sleeping in the same room where he'd hung his high school football trophies. The sporting goods business that had been the foundation of our family's wealth and status finally went completely under about a year ago. My dad had been too stubborn and set in his traditional ways to adapt to the changing retail landscape, and the mounting debts finally became insurmountable. He was forced to sell all 3 stores to pay off creditors, and even then, they barely broke even on what they owed. They lost the big colonial house that had been the symbol of their success, and were forced to move into a small, cramped apartment in a much less prestigious part of town. My mom, who hadn't worked a day in her life since marrying my father, had to get her first job in over 30 years, working part-time at a department store, folding clothes and dealing with difficult customers for minimum wage. The country club membership that had been so important to their social status was canceled due to non-payment. The matching luxury cars were repossessed by the bank. The whole perfect image they'd spent their entire lives building and maintaining crumbled like a house of cards. Everything they'd valued, the status, the money, the social connections, was gone. Tyler tried reaching out to me once through a mutual friend about 6 months ago, asking if I'd be willing to talk and possibly reconcile. I told the friend to tell him that some bridges can't be rebuilt once they've been completely burned, and that actions have consequences that last forever. I never heard from him again after that. Meanwhile, Sophie and I are doing better than we ever have before. We bought a bigger, more beautiful house last year in an even better neighborhood than where we started. We travel whenever and wherever we want, exploring places we've always dreamed of visiting. We have genuine friends who actually like us for who we are as people, not for what we can do for them or how we make them look. And we're seriously talking about starting a family of our own in the near future. When we do have children, they'll grow up knowing that love doesn't come with conditions or strings attached. They'll understand that family means accepting people for who they are, not trying to change them or mold them into something else. Most importantly, they'll learn that treating people with respect and basic human decency is infinitely more important than maintaining some fake image or artificial status. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh in my treatment of them. The thought crosses my mind occasionally, usually late at night when I'm reflecting on everything that's happened. But then, I remember exactly how they treated the woman I love. How they made her feel unwelcome in her own country. How they tried to make me choose between their racism and my happiness. How they refused to even acknowledge her existence until they desperately needed something from me. And when I remember all of that, I realized that everything that happened to them was entirely their own doing. They created this situation through years of deliberate choices and actions. They wanted to use me when it became convenient for their purposes, but they never wanted to love me unconditionally for who I actually was. They wanted a white grandchild to continue their precious legacy, but they weren't willing to accept a Mexican daughter-in-law as an equal member of their family. They wanted all the benefits of having a family without any of the responsibilities that come with treating family members with respect. The irony of the whole situation is absolutely perfect when you think about it. They could have had everything they claimed to want. They could have had a close relationship with their son, a brilliant and successful daughter-in-law who genuinely cared about family, and eventually grandchildren who would have known and appreciated both sides of their heritage. But their racism and prejudice were more important to them than their actual family relationships. So they lost absolutely everything instead. And honestly, I couldn't be happier about how it all turned out. Sometimes the universe really does give people exactly what they deserve. And this is one of those rare cases where justice actually prevailed. My parents spent years telling me that Sophie wasn't good enough for our family, constantly questioning her worth and her place in our lives. As it turns out, they weren't good enough for ours. TLDR. My racist family disowned me for marrying a Mexican woman, then came crawling back years later begging me to be a sperm donor when their golden child couldn't have kids. I led them on with false hope, and then told them exactly why they could go fuck themselves. They lost everything. Their business, their house, their money, their status. And I'm living my absolute best life with the woman they said wasn't good enough for me.